Well, so with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panel. So please come out. Their topic is the shifting sands in Internet governance. And since it's a panel, I think questions will be very important. I've been thinking about it quite a bit. First of all, I asked myself, Paul, why the sands are shifting? And then if there's sand, does it mean it's impermanent? You know, that things are not the way they should be? And then I got to thinking, I got really scared because somebody's governing the Internet, and I didn't actually know that. So hopefully they'll tell us that. And finally, of course, the obvious question is we're talking about technology policy. And what does that really mean? Probably they have much more important questions than these, but I got interested just in the title. Paul Mitchell is a senior leader here at Microsoft. He has broad experience in knowledge and policy and standards, and I want to personally thank him because we had an idea for what we'd like to do, but really it was Paul's work that pulled together both Mary and Sally, who have joined us to do that. Mary Saunders is Director of Standards Coordination at NIST, and Sally Wentworth is a Senior Manager of Public Policy at the Internet Society. And they both have broad knowledge and experience and have been thinking about this and talking about this. And I'm sure that you'll really enjoy their technology policy.
I haven't actually heard technology policy defined as something that would be enjoyable before, but we'll try to make it interesting. And I thought that the way to start this off would be to ask Sally to give a little bit of an overview of just exactly how has the Internet governance environment worked? Where did all this come from? And what are these shifting sands? So, Sally.
Great. Thanks, and hello, everyone. I thought maybe I'd just ask the audience a little participation here. How many of you have heard of the International Telecommunication Union? Yeah. Good number. Okay. And were all of you aware that in the UN system there's a topic of discussion called Internet governance? Okay, a little bit fewer. So I think this is a way to perhaps bring those two concepts together. For those of you who aren't aware, the International Telecommunication Union is a specialized agency of the United Nations. It has deep historic roots in the international community dating back to the 1800s when it was the International Telegraph Union. So it's been around for a long time and has changed its scope and its mandate periodically throughout the years to accommodate the changes in technology. They govern themselves on the basis of treaty. It is a treaty-based organization. The treaties of the ITU are signed and ratified by the ITU member states, roughly 193 member states. And so it is a legal organization that does a broad range of work in the telecommunications space, including spectrum allocation, satellite issues, radio regulations, telecommunication standards, development work, etc. One of the treaties of the ITU is something called the International Telecommunication Regulations, and I brought a copy, because that's what I do. It's a short treaty. It, again, has been around for a long time, originating back in the 1800s as a telegraph regulations, and has again since changed over the years. But it is now the International Telecommunication Regulations, and the treaty was last negotiated in 1988. The international community a number of years ago decided that it was time to update this treaty in light of the changing environment, in light of perhaps many of the things that many of you in this room are working on, the thinking being that the international treaty structure wasn't sufficient to accommodate the changes in technology. The treaty itself really does reflect the era in which it was written, 1988. Think about what the communications landscape looked like then. Largely telecom monopolies, government, very strong government involvement in the communications marketplace. If you were an end user, you would think high costs to make a telephone call. And these are really reflected in this 1988 treaty in that governments felt like they needed to decide and determine how traffic would move across borders. how money would be exchanged, what you would do with things like safety of life communications, priority communications, and the like. And that is this treaty. It's actually very short. It's only about 15 pages. It's at a fairly high level of generality, and they're going to revise it this year in Dubai. So governments, as we speak, are preparing to negotiate this treaty, make changes to the treaty. And one of the concerns that a number of us have is that the changes that have been proposed would sweep in aspects of the internet architecture, of other communications technologies that are currently not encompassed by the treaty. That could have implications for things like global interoperability, the connectivity prices, the architecture, the standards, and a number of the other things that perhaps we all take as a given to do the work that we do. So one of the things that I would pose to you is that this is a very important policy event. This is moving from a level of abstraction, which we've seen in past policy events where we issue declarations, statements of principle, and moving into treaty text, which will be signed and ratified by member states. When we look at some of the proposals that have come forward, we see things related to standards. We see things related to routing of traffic, numbering, internet, perhaps IP addresses, cybersecurity, a host of topics that, again, go to fundamental aspects of the architecture that we need to be global, not fragmented, affordable, allow for the free expression of ideas, to allow for the movement of data across borders. And I think it's really important, and one of the things that the Internet Society has seen is that it's really important that the technical community get engaged in this discussion. Governments need to hear from you how you use the infrastructure, how much you depend upon it, what things you may want to see changed, what things should not be changed. And that voice needs to be heard by governments around the world so that they can make effective decisions at this conference in Dubai. So maybe I'll stop there and we can move on.
All right, thanks. So Mary, the ITU has been an organization that has been around for well over 100 years and has been instrumental in actually enabling telecommunication services in many countries around the world. And as a specialized agency of the United Nations, which, of course, came after ITU was founded, which is interesting in and of itself. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the sort of role of standards, both in enabling telecommunications generally, and then how we should think about standards going forward relative to the Internet.
Okay.
And the ITU's role thereof.
Yeah, so let me, thanks, Paul, and let me start by giving you just a very high-level overview of why NIST is engaged in this set of discussions at all. So NIST is the National Measurement Institute for the United States. So we have 4 laboratories, an information technology laboratory. That laboratory in particular has specific responsibilities for federal government systems with respect to the security of those systems. So writes federal information processing standards, as well as, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the NIST special publications for computer systems and mobile applications most recently. We have an engineering lab, a materials measurement, and a physical measurement lab. About 30% of the NIST technical staff, over 400 individuals, scientists and engineers, participate in standards development activities in over 120 venues. Across all of the technology spaces where we do measurement research. A bulk of that, a large amount of that comes out of the Information Technology Laboratory in computer security, in high-speed networks, in accessibility, and a whole range of other IT-related areas. One of those standards venues is ITU-T. So ITU, as Sally mentioned, is a treaty organization. It has sectors. ITU-T is the telecommunications, but it's also known as the standardization sector. There's a radio sector and a development sector. ITU-T has currently 10 study groups that write voluntary technical standards in a variety of different areas, next generation networks, cloud computing. There's a whole study group on security. But the ITU-T activities, while widely used globally, are only one of N number of venues where these technical documents are written. And so NIST has for a long time had staff participating in relevant ITU study groups to represent both U.S. government interests as well as industry interests, because we work actively with a broad range of obviously Microsoft and a lot of the other providers, as well as network carriers and a range of other industry interests. And it's called a standards ecosystem related to telecommunications, but more broadly related to information and communication technologies, of which the Internet is a component. The Internet is an enabler. It enables, obviously, you all to conduct research and to share the results and the intermediate steps in that research. It enables lots of things. And so from the NIST perspective, we see it as a tool. And I think as a government agency, we play much more heavily in not only in the telecom aspects of standardization, and standards we see as infrastructure, which enables both the hardware to interoperate and conform to specifications, as well as the software and all of the services that are layered on top of that broad infrastructure. So that's why we have an interest. I think we play more heavily as an institute in the IT space than we do really in the telecom space. But that puts us in a unique position across the federal government, because our counterpart agencies who are engaged in preparing the U.S. government position for this World Conference coming up at the end of the year are from the Federal Communications Commission, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the Department of Defense, National Aerospace and NASA, and NSA, Aeronautics and Space Administration. So there are a broad variety of interests. Department of Homeland Security, let me not forget the Department of Homeland Security. A broad range of, I think, interests across the federal government. Ours is most closely related to the industrial and obviously the research, I think the research interests in this area. So why are we interested in what's happening in ITU and specifically in the standard space and how it might affect telecommunications, but I think more broadly information technology. Historically, the technology challenges that have faced industry as well as government agencies have been discrete. So there's a telecommunications stovepipe. If you look way back historically, there's a medical technologies area. There's a variety of different areas which didn't tend to cross over in many ways. The new technology challenges that the private sector and U.S. government agencies and agencies globally are looking at are the technologies are all converging. These are systems challenges. So everywhere we look, we have the smart grid, which is an physical infrastructure overlaid by an IT infrastructure. We have health IT, which are a series of physical locations in hospitals and physicians' offices, et cetera, overlaid with an IT infrastructure. And you heard about electronic health records this morning. We have smart manufacturing. So that's physical facilities overlaid with industrial control systems and communication systems. In all of these, the Internet is an enabler. Unless you completely isolate the system, you're communicating across Internet lines. Cloud computing, which we also heard a little bit about this morning. So we see systems challenges, multiple stakeholders that haven't typically worked together historically, even in the U.S. The U.S. approach to standards is that there are very important technical infrastructures that enable technology innovation, enable rapid deployment of new technologies, that standards development should be led by the private sector, typically, that the market will determine, in most cases, which technology is favored or multiple technologies are applied in a variety of different instances, and that the government only intervenes when there's a market failure. And we apply the same set of policies to the Internet space as well. Most of the Internet is operated in the private sector by commercial operators. Many of the services are provided by commercial operators. And many of the provisions that apply to those operators are sufficient to enable an active and rapidly evolving and changing Internet. So that that's the position we come from. It's a relatively unique position globally. So we're seeing a mesh up in different cultures in terms of not only the technologies that we're looking at. So engineers now need to sit down at the same table with computer scientists, who need to sit down with sociologists and all kinds of other disciplines to come up with systems solutions, technical solutions that can enable new products and new services. But governments that have not typically been as open in terms of sharing positions or in dealing with technical issues need to sit down at the same table. And again, you have another set of cultural issues that come into play too. So the part of internet, when it says internet governance right now, don't be scared, because the internet is not governed by governments, but the governance in a large sense is governed or managed by what the U.S. likes to call the multi-stakeholder process, which is everybody who has an interest in the internet, either the infrastructure or the lower layer of what enables the internet to actually talk to one another, or the applications that ride on top of that, has input to how it operates. What we're seeing currently, potentially with the ITU, the renegotiation of the international telecom regulations, is some melding of government interests in telecommunications services with broader commercial interests in being able to provide all kinds of new products and services in a very rapidly evolving environment. And so that's why NIST has become engaged to try to make clear to our fellow government agencies, as well as other governments and the private sector, the importance of the standards ecosystem and the multiple venues and the multiple tables at which people can come to write the best standards that can enable new products and services to reach consumers rapidly. And that is ITU-T, but it's also IETF and W3C and the IEEE and ISO and a whole range of other standards developing organizations, all of which compete to a certain extent. But that competition is in many senses healthy, because you come up with the best technical solution.
So as the internet as we know it launched in roughly 1994, and it took about a decade to get to the first billion people. And then it took only about half the time to get to the second billion people. And that first billion people were largely North America and other developed countries. And the second billion people has increasingly been what we call the BRICS countries: Brazil, India, Russia, China, South Africa. And if we follow that curve, we're heading to hitting 4 billion people just about 6-7 years from now, which is pretty amazing. But if you think about it, it also means that there's a greater level of cultural diversity on a single global information system than there has ever been in the past. And I wonder if the two of you could share some thoughts on really what the implications of that increased diversity, cultural diversity, are, both from a forward innovation perspective and from a sort of a cultural preservation perspective, if you want to think of it that way, which is, in other words, how do countries retain their identity while sharing in this soup that we've created? So whoever wants to go first.
It's a tough one, but I think it's fair to say that as we bring more users and more cultures, as you said, into this global information system, we're creating new opportunities and new challenges for the internet. On the challenges, we will have different governing approaches to whether that's to standards or writing public policies or the like. The other challenge, of course, is that the internet tends not to respect traditional national boundaries. Just simply the way the traffic moves, the interconnection policies, the sheer evolution of the network is not necessarily respectful of the traditional political and geopolitical boundaries that we've become accustomed to. That's going to create challenges for policymakers. It creates challenges for end users who are confronted with different approaches, different information than they've ever been confronted with. On the other hand, it also is empowering people in some of these cultures, in these countries that have never had a voice before. And politically, that has huge implications for the technology, but also for, I think, all of us, wherever we sit on the globe. And that's something that we have to both preserve and maybe grow in some sense. And the internet structures that have, quote unquote, governed the internet, whether they are the standards organizations or the domain name industry or the industry itself, the commercial entities or the technical community, all have to learn how to embrace the new billions of users that are coming online and the new technologies that they're going to bring with them. They're going to change the internet to work in the environments that they come from. And that's okay. And part of what that means is, in going to Mary's point about making sure that we continue this internet ecosystem, continue this diversity, it allows the technology to continue to evolve. There are challenges that will come up in 2 years' time that we won't have thought of here today. And the technology and the standards need to be able to develop and accommodate those challenges and solve those problems, and not be locked in and too rigid, and not be able to take that on.
Yeah, I would say I've seen it. I've seen the environment change in the standards space over the past 10 years, and certainly over the past 5 years in particular. A lot of the major standards developing organizations 10 years ago were developing standards for either more national markets or maybe even regional markets. Now it's very important to be working in the global space, and that has implications for the membership in those organizations. I've been involved in IEEE Standards Association for many years and was on the Board of Governors for a couple of years. During that time, we saw a tremendous push by IEEE to increase the international membership, not only in of the engineers, but in the standards development work itself. And there are some IEEE standards committees that actually were more than 50% non-U.S. or non-North American participants if there was a particular area of interest. I see that happening in a lot of other standards venues as well, trying where they don't already have international participation, attracting international participation, doing a really good job trying to reach out to key technical interests in countries that haven't typically historically been involved. On the flip side, dealing with governments such as China and South Korea and other Indonesia and other governments, they look at the standards areas as an area where they would like to be leaders. And so I see a lot of great interest of technical experts and also governments in participating in these standards activities. That's a good thing. It sometimes stretches the resources and the capacities of the standards developing organizations as they have to flex to the new sort of set of discussions. But I think we're seeing that ideas coming in from other parts of the world outside of the OECD countries is actually benefiting the standards the range of standards that are available as well. So the whole system's flexing.
So I wonder, standards are great in that they provide certainty in many ways, right? You're certain that the outlets here will take all your laptops with no problem, as an example. But I wonder whether that creation of certainty runs the risk of creating a winners and losers environment, and to what extent that might be playing into some of what's happening.
It plays into a lot. I mean, we have an official policy that standards should be technology neutral. In some cases, that's impossible. And so we also, our preference is to allow competing technologies where relevant both to be standardized and have them sort of match head-to-head in the market. And there's a very careful determination which should be made in the private sector, not by the government, as to when to standardize so that it facilitates innovation, and when you standardize too soon and it locks in a particular technology. So that's certainly the case. And the standards committee, the folks that sit around a standards committee table, either virtually or in face-to-face, they're all competitors to a large. I mean, that's the beauty of a standards committee. It brings competitors into the same discussion, and they all contribute the best technical ideas. But then you frequently have those head-to-head commercial arguments and discussions which may affect the standards process. And speaking from the point of view of foreign governments, when they're looking at establishing a leadership position, it's looking at moving their technologies into the standards process and possibly leading through that venue. So it's as somebody from the State Department once mentioned, it's the Wild West. I mean, we like it, but some people find it too messy.
So the Wild West sounds a lot like what the internet is.
Yeah,
And it seems to me that throughout its history, there's been a lot of things put out there for the market to try, and some have succeeded and some have failed along the way. But I wonder whether there's a challenge to the broader research community and sort of the innovation community that's created by the uncertainty of environment in which you can put anything out, and it might be here today and it might be gone tomorrow.
I think we've certainly seen that evolving since the creation of the internet or the commercialization of the internet. And I think that's been okay. I think there's been that tension, and a little bit of that tension is acceptable because it's what motivates additional creativity, additional research, and additional ideas out into the marketplace. The concern that we have with some of what we're seeing in the UN system is a desire to move so far in the direction of certainty that you might limit the ability of somebody to throw out the next great application or or great technology that we don't know about. And I know sometimes that sounds a little flip, and we hear that a lot, but there really is, if we're looking at some of the standards being proposed in different standards bodies, or in particular in the ITU-T related to something like cloud computing, if that became mandatory, if those standards became mandatory, they would then supersede the standards related to cloud computing going on in the host of other standards organizations that are working on the topic. So you might get certainty at the cost of innovation, at the cost of moving forward, or even at the cost of solving some of the problems that may emerge in that field over the coming years, where people are really going to need to be able to get the right experts together and work out some of these challenges. So I think the tension is healthy.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would agree with that. But I guess I would build on top of that something we talked about briefly a little bit earlier. There are not only different cultures coming in the internet and the telecommunications space more narrowly, but different sets of interests. In some markets where we already have broad, pervasive broadband, fiber optic access, there's a lot of interest in mobile applications and the newest, latest thing, and voice over IP and lots of other bells and whistles for communications. In some parts of the world, Africa, for example, they're still looking at establishing the backbone which will allow just consistent, regular communications. And I think the system, both the ITU system, but also more broadly the public-private partnership in the system, needs to take account of all those multiple interests. So we need to be able to work with countries and regulators in countries to develop capacity and a greater understanding of what they're buying, to be informed purchasers, while still allowing for the flexibility for markets where they have a higher appetite for a broader range of more complicated applications. We need to come to some kind of resolution that allows both. It's still a high level in the international telecom regulations that give regulators in countries that are responsible for international telecommunication services some certainty about what they need to look for without choking off innovation.
So the last treaty, which is this goes back a very long way, but the last treaty negotiation was in 1988, and it covered, I think you said, basically the rates paid from country to country and network sufficiency for life, safety, et cetera. And it sounds like at that time there was an acknowledged intergovernmental role for some international regulations for the telecommunications system. So you fast forward and we're at 2012, and there are a number of proposals to update the treaty, which would seem logical because a lot of what the treaty was built on doesn't really exist in the same way anymore. But what do you think is perhaps an appropriate role for this type of treaty going forward?
I think one of the things that we've said is we take this treaty at its word, and it was written in 1988, again, as I said, a product of its era. We didn't have high levels of competition among service providers. We didn't see a lot of regulatory transparency or regulatory independence. These are all things that have emerged, and privatization as well, have emerged in the last 25 years, particularly in light of some of the WTO agreements, but beyond that. And if you actually did a word search on this treaty, you would find no reference to the word competition. So there are some things that have worked. There are some things that clearly have grown up and policies that have clearly developed since 1988 that could be reflected in this treaty. Where I think we wouldn't want to go is to lock specific technologies in place. We also don't want to do things that would fragment networks. And we do see some of the proposals that could move us in that direction. And I also think we want to keep the treaty at a high enough level of principle that it doesn't get into the operational details that may change within the next, will certainly change within the next 25 years, or whenever this treaty gets renegotiated. So looking at what's worked would be, I think, a really good place to start for a treaty like this.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would agree. There are issues that have been put on the table in the run-up to the meeting in December for discussion. This is the period of time that all of the ITU member states are actually putting forward proposals for issues to address in the ITRs. And some of those proposals are for enhancements to the existing regulations, enhancements to language to take account of the fact that we're in 2012 now versus 1988. Some proposals would add new topics that haven't been dealt for in the international telecom regulations. I think I can safely say the U.S. government actively supports using the existing international telecommunication regulations as the basis for negotiations and looking first to clarifying and updating the references so that they accurately reflect the current environment while maintaining the multi-stakeholder governance structures that have been set up since 1988 and maintaining the voluntary nature of the technical standards that underpin the infrastructure. You know, from the U.S. perspective, you could be flip and say, well, the U.S. government could always take a reservation if what came out of the renegotiation was completely unpalatable, but that's not a really successful strategy for going into the negotiation. We'd like to see something coming out that meets, most of the concerns of the governments that are around the table, while maintaining the private sector commercial nature of the internet.
Okay, so maybe as an attempt to make this concrete, could you give an example of one of the proposals that you would be concerned about?
Well, one of the ones that has gotten quite a bit of attention is around the routing of traffic. And there is a proposal that's been put forward by one government, supported by a number of governments, that says that governments should have the right to know how their traffic is being routed and to govern the routing of traffic as necessary to address issues related to security and fraud. Now, again, that could be done for a host of reasons why governments would like to do that. But what that does fundamentally is it goes against the grain of the internet. It is not consistent with how traffic is being routed. And that goes back to an initial question, which is, are we talking about telecommunications traffic or are we talking about IP traffic? And this is something that the governments are currently wrestling with. But you could see, the ramifications of a proposal like that. It would reverberate throughout the architecture, and that's something that we clearly have big concerns about.
And there are a set of proposals that have come from a variety of different sources related to security. Security is not currently addressed in the international telecom regulations. There's a major resolution that came out of the last plenipotentiary meeting in 2010, the ITU plenipotentiary meeting, which addresses security and information and communication technologies, but there's nothing in the regulations. And there have been a series of proposals about not only addressing network security, which is the security of what Sally was talking about, how traffic moves internationally, but also talking about the security of the content, which is the traffic that's actually moving, which is a big leap from the infrastructure and ensuring quality of service and assuring services to actually diving into what is actually transferred.
Well, and then there's a proposal that builds on that, which says that the content should not undermine the security of regimes or otherwise interfere in the internal activities of a government. Right. So you go from the routing of traffic to the security of the information to what is the information being moved.
Yeah.
So that sounds pretty egregious if you read it one way.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, if you take a strict reading that it's really just about security and just about integrity, why would that be a bad thing? If you could actually enforce it that way.
Well, I think you just hit at the core of it. It's if you take a narrow reading of the terminology, that leads you to one conclusion. I think there's an issue of how broadly or narrowly the terms that are being proposed are interpreted. There's an issue of translation. Does security mean the same thing in English as it does in French or Chinese, and the modifiers that go along with that? And then you mentioned another point, how you enforce it. So who is it that's enforcing it?
Well, my question actually was relative to this sort of treaty process.
Yeah.
This sounds messy and difficult. And how
right.
does this process actually get to common understanding?
Well, it is a messy process, and in fact, in the ITU's tradition of negotiating these kinds of treaties, the preparations for this go on for years in advance of the event itself. And so the ITU and the member states have been preparing for this treaty for almost 2 years now, putting proposals, putting ideas on the table, talking about them. And the goal is to move from 193 positions into a consensus document that, and the ITU hopes to do that without voting. The ITU Secretary General has insisted that this will not come to a vote, and we'll see if that's the case. But it will be messy and it will be difficult. One of the other challenges of the process is that this is, at its core, an intergovernmental process. So it's an intergovernmental process that could touch upon things that are rightly and appropriately being dealt with in the technical community, by civil society, by industry. And those groups are, by and large, not in the room. And so the challenge between now and December, when the conference happens, is to what extent national governments will open their process, open their thinking up to their domestic constituencies of their engineers, of civil society, of industry, so that they can have an input on what proposals their governments ultimately agree to or don't agree to. And that's some of the messiness that really, really needs to happen between now and December.
Yeah. So, I mean, even in the U.S., which has a very open process, I think, Paul, you can speak from Microsoft's perspective, but State Department and NIST and other federal agencies have gone out and encouraged industry and other constituencies to get more involved. But I think it was pretty much of a sleeper issue for quite some time.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
I think about this routing proposal as essentially an attempt to re-engineer the functioning of the internet through legislation without understanding how it actually functions.
Right.
To start with.
Yeah, and I think it's important sometimes to look at what's driving some of these proposals. They are manifesting themselves in increasingly technical concepts. And that's a newer phenomenon. We didn't see that in the internet governance space 5 or 10 years ago. But governments are getting more interested in the technology and the underlying technology. But in terms of the drivers, you do have economic drivers, countries where connectivity costs are very high. Mm-hmm. This treaty in 1988 was a way to recover revenues in the traditional telecommunications networks, to split the costs of a call, essentially, between countries. And that revenue is on the decline, on the very rapid decline. And so countries are trying to figure out, can they recover revenues? So that may be one driver. There are countries that are trying to figure out how to deal with cybersecurity. That's another driver. We did hear at the last ITU meeting, one country said, cyber whatever you want to call it, cyber crime, cybersecurity, cyber terrorism, we just need to deal with that. And so they've got some really tough things that they're trying to address, obviously. I think where we come from is it's not clear that a couple lines in a treaty is the way to ultimately resolve what are fundamentally very technical or economic challenges that countries all over the world are having to work through.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mentioned the technology challenges we're looking at are systems level. They're very complicated. And most of the expertise globally lies in the private sector and civil society and the research universities. And so it's more common in the U.S. for government agencies to communicate with those constituencies to get technical input to inform regulatory decisions. That needs to be more broadly a global model as the issues become increasingly complicated and increasingly technical. Governments need that assistance to make informed decisions.
So there are a couple of other internet governance things that are out there that just to make it more confusing. There is a thing called the Internet Governance Forum, which would seem that it's the place to go talk about internet governance, just from its name. And then, of course, there's ICANN.
Right.
And I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about the respective roles of those two organizations.
Well, I think you've named two, but there are a host
more.
there are a lot of organizations with different and unique roles. And the Internet Governance Forum was formed at the UN World Summit on the Information Society back in 2005. After the international community recognized that a continuing discussion and a continuing dialogue in these issues was really important, that there was a real desire by governments to understand the technology. There was a real desire by non-government members to have a chance to interact with governments and other stakeholders from around the world. And so the Internet Governance Forum is under the auspices of the UN, but is a truly multi-stakeholder environment. The agenda is set by a broad and diverse group of people. There are workshops. It's really kind of a roll up your sleeves and try to learn environment. It's held all over the world. And one of the interesting things about it is that it has created, or there are subsets of it now. There are regional Internet Governance Forums. The East Africa Internet Governance Forum is meeting, I think it's this week or next week. Kenya just had theirs. The United States Internet Governance Forum will happen at the end of July. Canada has one. Portugal just had one. So it's really been, it really has initiated that kind of dialogue. There's no negotiation, there's no text that comes out of it, so people aren't on their toes ready to negotiate. They're really there to discuss. ICANN, the International Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, is the organization that develops the policies to manage the domain name system. That is also a multi-stakeholder environment, a lot of different constituencies, whether they were government or country code operators or other groups, registries, registrars, come together to develop the policies that make the domain name system work. And so it's a different environment with a different purpose.
Okay, so I'd like to open it up to questions from all of you. If the lights go down a little bit, I can actually see hands.
See a hand right in the middle.
And wait, okay, number 2 we'll start with right here.
I think you can just talk.
Yeah.
Another side of the coin for the security,
Yes.
there are divides to realize internet governance or internet democracy. As in case of the first World Summit in Geneva for the Information Society in Geneva, Kofi Annan, Director General, pointed out the 7 types of digital divides. That is a very important aspect to realize the internet governance and the internet democracy. And I want to know the current status of discussion, and I want to know the remedies to realize or to reduce the digital divide for 7 billion people.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And that is a huge issue. I mean, we could even talk about, with the deployment of broadband in the United States, we could even talk about a digital divide within the U.S. from areas which were early served with fiber optics to more rural areas. But when you speak globally, the UN, certainly as an entity, one of the sectors of the ITU is the ITU-D, the development sector, and most of the activities of ITU-D is focused on outreach, capacity building, and shrinking the digital divide. I know that OECD and the U.S. government specifically has several activities and programs in place, many through the State Department, but not all through the State Department, to help build capacity globally such that we can help minimize the digital divide. But it's a significant issue.
Yeah, I think it does remain a significant challenge, and I think it's one of those things that, as we were saying, as you bring more cultures and more people online, the internet governance structures as they exist really do have to welcome new communities and new users into their midst, and we all have to do that. I know from the Internet Society's perspective, one of our founding principles and one of our key objectives was helping to bring at the time in 1992 and beyond, it was bringing the next billion online, which of course we're far beyond that now. But we try to do that with the technology itself. Building some, we call it, internet exchange points in countries and in regions to try to keep traffic local, bring content home, and lower connectivity costs. That's one mechanism. We also try to do it by enabling individuals from developing countries to attend and actively participate in the internet governance mechanisms. We have fellowships to the Internet Engineering Task Force, fellowships to the Internet Governance Forum, to the OECD, and elsewhere. And again, it's trying to bring the next community of users into these processes, and hopefully, and in many cases we're already seeing this, as they become leaders of the process, that's going to be critical in meeting those objectives that the UN set out.
Great. Next question.
There's another
Two at the back. Yeah. Two's active.
Hi, Greg Dudek from McGill. So given the difficulty that it's taken, the amount of trouble it's been for the IETF to come up with new policies, I was wondering what you think the chances are of a failure to actually come up with an agreement in December, and what the consequences of that would be. And finally, if there is an agreement, to what extent it actually constrains companies from doing other things outside the bounds of that agreement?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I do think the ITU process generally does reach agreement historically. So I think if we have that to rely on, if past is any predictor of the future, there will be a treaty, and most governments will be inclined to move in that direction. And I also think there will be a certain amount of political peer pressure, so to speak, in the diplomatic communities for a successful outcome. There are provisions and accommodations for countries. They can take something called a reservation to the treaty and say, this and this does not apply, or we understand the treaty to mean this. And in fact, if you take a look at 2/3 of this document, it's actually filled with those very reservations. So countries have already done that, and that's in good UN tradition. At the same time, if you have too many of those differing interpretations, it creates a certain amount of legal uncertainty for the companies like Microsoft and others who are, working on global networks, moving information across borders, running essentially global companies. And if country X says we are going to regulate the routes of your traffic and country Y says we won't, the costs will go up for everyone. Never mind the fact of whether the engineering could even support that.
Right. So there will be some kind of an agreement in December at the conclusion of the negotiations. I'd say from my minor experience with another UN negotiation, UNFCCC negotiations, they may as they say in State Department parlance, kick the can down the road on certain issues that are just too difficult to negotiate. And there are a variety of different instruments related to the treaty itself. They can move those into a resolution or a recommendation or an opinion. They can put off further discussion, further more detailed discussion to meetings that will take place in following years. So there are a variety of different ways they can deal with the issues that are easiest to deal with, hopefully set some stretch goals, but there are valves to let off steam for issues that just can't be negotiated in a treaty. Our hope would be, as Sally said, that we don't take too many of those issues and kick the can down the road such that they're dealt with later, that we can get a holistic treaty available which gives enough certainty to companies without strangling the commercial opportunities or limiting the commercial opportunities to enable to move forward.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, I'll give each of you the opportunity then to do a little sum up, final thoughts before hitting the vote.
Well, I think if I were to leave you with a thought, it is that the policy realm can no longer be separate from the technical and research communities. I think it's really, really important that you are involved with your policymakers, that you can provide input, that they can rely on your expertise, because the policy decisions that they're making, as I said earlier, are increasingly technical. They have increasingly technical implications. And for them to make good decisions, they need to hear from all of us. That's our responsibility as members of the Internet community. And we can no longer afford to let the policymakers go off to Geneva or wherever it is, the city of choice, while the technical work gets done completely separate from that. The two worlds need to come together. We can't take this model for granted. And I really would encourage you to get involved with your governments. Ask them, where do I show up? How am I heard in this process? If you're developing a national position, how? On what basis? These are important questions that governments need to be asked, and they need to hear it from all parts of their constituencies.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and it certainly applies to, we've encouraged industry to get involved globally. I would say the global research community, it's very important for you also to be involved and ask those questions and also contribute technical input, because not only telecommunications writ narrowly, but the Internet more broadly is it's a hugely important research tool as well as a communications tool. So it's important to all of us.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank you for being a great audience and thank my guests, Mary and Sally, and remind you that the buses will leave for the boat promptly. And so thanks very much for the day.
Thank you.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.